Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us here at Radically Rural in the Land and Community Track. We're really happy to have you, both here in person and for folks who are joining us virtually. So the focus of this track, the Land and Community Track, is really all about how do we connect with the land? How is it to the benefit of our economies, our health, and sort of really just overall well-being? And so many people derive their livelihoods from the landscape, whether it be through recreation, agriculture, or forestry. And many of us are drawn to live in rural areas because of the beauty in our connection to that landscape. So we're really going to be digging into these topics throughout the course of today and tomorrow. And in particular, we're looking at things sort of with the changes and the challenges we're facing with climate change, with the pandemic, and sort of how that impacts our landscape and our connection to it in our communities. So I'd like to just start out by saying thank you to the Caterpillar Lab, who is the sponsor of this track in 2021. And our session right now is Rural as Refuge. And the format we're going to have is 30 minutes of a speaker. We're going to stop, take questions. We'll be taking questions both from our virtual attendees through the chat, as well as from you here in person. And then we're going to, after both speakers have had a chance to share, we're going to open it up for a broader dialogue, hopefully sort of get into some of the things that you guys are seeing here in your own communities with these challenges and reacting to what our speakers are going to be sharing about. And we do ask you for your phone volume to be turned off. But if you are interested in participating in the chat feature, please do sign on to the Socio app and you can contribute to the chat there and see what's happening. But for the Q&A session, we do have a mic and we can go around here. You don't have to type it into the chat and everybody will be able to see all the questions. I just want to say that the restrooms, for anyone who needs them, are just behind us in the hallway here, and that we really appreciate your patience as we work through this hybrid event and learning sort of how we can sort of, technologically forge forward in this new world of ours. So thank you for your interest in this work that we're doing. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our speakers after I've shared their bios. So our first speaker today is Peter Nelson. He's a professor at Middlebury College, the Department of Geography. And he joined the faculty there in 1999. He holds a PhD and master's in geography from the University of Washington and a BA in geography from Dartmouth College. He teaches courses on population geography, the global economy, and the rural United States. Currently, with support from USDA, Peter's examining the ways in which urban-rural migration systems have shifted throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, his research focused on rural gentrification. He has also examined subprime lending in rural housing markets and the connections between aging baby boomers and Latinos arriving in certain rural destinations. Peter lives in Weybridge, Vermont, population 824, certainly rural, with his wife and 2 sons. When he is not studying rural landscapes, he enjoys running, biking, hiking, skiing, fly fishing, gardening, golfing through them. Our second speaker today, we're happy to have Cheryl Morse join us, and she's a rural geographer at the University of Vermont. She researches the production of landscapes, livelihoods, and everyday human experience in rural places. She has conducted research in working landscapes, rural migration and immobility, place and identity, and nature culture theory. A member of the geography faculty, she also co-directs the environmental studies program and is a member of the food systems graduate faculty at the University of Vermont. She is chair-elect of the Vermont Land Trust Board of Trustees and associate editor of the Journal of Rural Studies. In the category of fun, she officiates youth lacrosse, gardens, explores dirt road, and studies dowsing. Well, thank you very much for being here, and Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amanda, for that introduction. Thank you to the people who I can see in 3 dimensions, and thank you to the people that are participating virtually. This is the first conference that I've presented in person since July of 2019. And I can't tell you how happy I am to be here with you, both in person and those that are attending virtually. I may be a little rusty in my conference presentation jam, so bear with me a little bit. Few would argue that the COVID-19 pandemic has altered the way that we live. We attend conferences virtually. We socialize virtually. I certainly order a lot more takeout. We do all kinds of things now in formats that we didn't do prior to the pandemic. But as the pandemic unfolded, there also began to be reports of not just changing ways in how we live, but also changing geographies of where we live. So what I'd like to talk about today is some evidence of some of these shifting geographies of settlement, particularly as they impact rural areas. The popular press started to pick up on this theme very early in the pandemic, with stories appearing, appearing as early as March in the Washington Post about the Great American Migration. In May, the New York Times has run a series of stories, but they document how the wealthiest neighborhoods were the neighborhoods that emptied out the most during the pandemic. Local newspapers like the Vermont Digger reports people relocating from Boston, New York, et cetera, to rural Vermont. And even abroad, there's been a kind of reorganization of the settlement geography as demographers in Europe have begun to wonder if the pandemic will reverse the brain drain, say, as Italians move to London, to San Francisco, et cetera. They're moving back and working remotely from rural Italy. What I'm interested in presenting to you today is an analysis that I complete at two different spatial scales. So on the one hand, I'm interested in looking at how people might have moved from one county to another county, from a metropolitan county to a non-metropolitan county. We often think of non-metropolitan as being equivalent to rural, at least in the scholarly world interested in migration. But the press was also reporting during the early stages of the pandemic a renewed interest in suburban living, or a movement out of the more densely settled neighborhoods of urban areas into peripheral regions within metropolitan areas, rural portions of those metropolitan counties. So the unique data that I am able to access allows me to capture the types of population shifts at both a county scale and at a census tract scale, a much smaller, finer grained spatial geography. The problem with all of this is really a lack of conventional data. The Census Bureau is really good at reporting data, but they tend to do it on an annual basis. Every July, they release population estimates that include estimates of net migration at the county scale for the previous year. However, they don't do that in years that they're conducting a census. So in 2020, they normally would not be releasing any population estimates in July of 2020. They ended up releasing some very recently, but those net migration estimates look at population change from July 1st, say 2019, to July 1st, 2020. The pandemic did not unfold between July 1st and July 1st, but rather it unfolded daily, weekly, monthly during the early days of 2020. So conventional data sources either didn't exist or were really poorly equipped to allow us to ask these questions about how was population shifting in the context of the pandemic. So this is where I get to play with some different kind of data. I have to be creative. Well, it turns out we're all carrying around pretty good data loggers. And when we agree to the terms and conditions to download an app, we're also agreeing, whether we know it or not, because I can assure you that I never read the terms and conditions. I just say, yes, I need to be able to manage my fantasy football team with Yahoo, so I want the Yahoo Sports app. When we agree to those terms and conditions, we agree to have our locations recorded. And several companies collect this geographical information about where our devices move, and they sell it to people. They sell it to companies that are interested in knowing where people are going and which people are passing through which pathways to buy their latte at Starbucks or, whatever. But a company called Safegraph, which aggregates information from these our data loggers in our pockets from lots of different app platforms, they provide to the academic community free of charge aggregate counts of the number of mobile devices they determine to be at home in every census block. And a census block is even smaller than a census tract. So it's a really, really fine-grained geographic scale. And they determine a phone is at home at a location if it stops moving around during the evening hours at the same location for 14 consecutive nights. So it's not changing a home location if you go on vacation. My phone did not relocate from Weybridge, Vermont to Keene, New Hampshire. I bet it is in the Safegraph data, it did not reassign me to a new home because I'm only here for a night or two. So what I do, and they release these data monthly. So I can get a monthly count of the number of phones that are at home in each one of these census block groups. And then I can aggregate those block groups up to any geography that I'm interested in. I can aggregate them to tracts. I can aggregate them to counties. So what I've done is I've taken these 52 million phones that Safegraph is recording their locations of every month, and I've created two different data sets, one at the tract level and one at the county level to complete this analysis. And I'm comparing changes in the number of devices, say in April of 2020, and I'm comparing it to changes in the number of devices in April of 2019. And I do this to try to control for some kind of seasonality. If you've got a place like Cape Cod that's going to get a lot of devices relocating there for the summer because it's a summer vacation, if I compare change in June of 2020 to June in 2019, I get some kind of control for that seasonality. Okay? And the last thing I do, there is some fluctuation in the total number of devices that Safegraph is tracking on a month-by-month basis. So I control for the overall change in the size of the database, and I look at the difference between how the overall size of the database is changing with these place-specific month-to-month changes, and I calculate what I call a shift. That shift can be positive, or that shift can be negative. And the shifts are a proxy for migration. It turns out that the correlation between the number of devices in a place and the number of people in a place is about 98%. So it's a pretty good indication of changes in population. All right? And the interpretation is important, so a positive shift indicates two things. It either indicates increases in the number of devices above what we would expect because of what was going on in the overall database, or a smaller than expected number of decrease in devices. So it could be, if we're going to use migration terms, it could be above or more than expected in migration, or smaller than expected out migration. Slowing out migration could be what a positive shift is reflecting. And then a negative shift is the opposite. Either more than expected out migration or less than expected in migration. Okay? It's a little more methodology than maybe you wanted, but I think it's important that we get an understanding of what those interpretations are, all right? So just to give a little context, I'll provide some pre-pandemic, what was going on from 2015 to say 2019, what were the general patterns. And what's interesting is for the last 20 years, migration rates have been on a decline. As a population, people are moving less than they were, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So overall, people tend to be staying put, and there's all kinds of scholarship that's exploring the reasons behind that. But if we look at the geography of net migration, which I have summarized here in this bar chart, green represents non-metropolitan, red represents metropolitan, and then I've just got it divided by census division. There's a couple clear patterns that this graph reveals. First, there's a regional shift out of the Northeast, Midwest census divisions, both metro and non-metro, to the South and West, the South Atlantic, West, South Central, Mountain, Pacific. So there's a regional redistribution of population, and this has been going on for 50 years. There's also a shift down the urban hierarchy, up the urban hierarchy. With a few exceptions, non-metropolitan regions have been losing population. In the Midwest, in the Mid-Atlantic, in the West South Central, and the East South Central, and really only the Mountain Division, the Rockies, and the Pacific show any real significant growth in the non-metropolitan population. So there's been a rural to urban migration generally. If we look at this on a map, the resolution gets a little grainier at that when it's that big. We can identify regions of really persistent population loss where net migration over just simply a 5-year period is drawing the population down by, say, more than 5%. 1% a year of the population is moving out of those counties shaded in the darkest red. So we see kind of from New England across the Rust Belt, pretty contiguous counties of population loss. We see steep losses along the Mississippi Delta, and people familiar with the Great Plains, we see pretty persistent population loss out on the Great Plains. This is what's happening pre-pandemic. And those few places that are seeing some kind of non-metropolitan population gain are in the Northern Rockies. They're on the Pacific Coast in Washington and Oregon, and in pockets in Southern Appalachia. All right, well now what everyone wants to know, like what's been going on since January of 2020, when the world started to slide sideways. And first we can look at this cartographically. So what I've presented up here are the April to April shifts, and then the October to October shifts, just two kind of snapshots. The beginning of the pandemic in April of 2020, and then after the summer surges, and then before the winter surges, what do things look like? Well, as early as April, what we see on this map are some of those regions that had been suffering persistent population loss are shaded in green. What do positive shifts indicate? Either above average in-migration or lower than expected out-migration. So I think what we're seeing here across the plains and across the Rust Belt is slowing out-migration. People weren't leaving the countryside to go to the city because there wasn't anything to do in the city, okay? Then by October, what we see here are much deeper greens spreading across the country. We get greens all the way up into New England, up into northern Wisconsin, places that had been red in April. We see pretty widespread migration response with rural places either retaining populations that would have left or attracting populations that were fleeing the city, okay? The next series of graphs or slides present the same shifts, but temporally, month to month, sort of as the pandemic unfolded. And I've tried to use color as a mechanism to organize them a little bit to help you see some of the temporal trends. But just know that as you read from left to right on these graphs that are coming up, you're progressing through time from 2019 into 2020 into 2021. All right, and the first, these are just for the non-metropolitan counties, and I've organized it by rough census division, census region. The Northeast, the Midwest, the South, and the West. So what do we see up here? Well, the first thing I'll draw your attention to are this blue chunk of bars, and this is 2019. This is pre-pandemic. And what you'll notice with these blue bars is that for each region, they're relatively small. They're the smallest bars in virtually all the regions. And what does that indicate? It means that 2019 was very similar to 2018. There wasn't that much difference between 2019 and 2018. Migration systems that we saw earlier were persistent from 2018 to 2019. Maybe there's some relatively larger bars in the Midwest, but still they're not as large as what was going on in 2020. Maybe we're seeing some slowdown of population loss in 2019. But what we're really interested in what was going on as the pandemic hit. And you'll notice that these green bars start in January of 2020, when the first cases began to be reported in the United States. And what do we see? In every region, those bars shift. There was significant jump in devices in non-metropolitan counties, positive shifts, most pronounced in the Midwest, but we see it in every region in January, February, March of 2020. And then what do we notice? Well, let me go back. What do we notice when we get from March to April? In every region, those positive shifts drop, and they drop pretty steeply. They're still positive, but they drop. What was happening in March? Well, governors were saying, stay home. Don't go anywhere. Everyone kind of froze in place, right? And those stay-at-home orders we see reflected in population movements. The populations that were moving towards these non-metropolitan areas in January, February, and March slowed down. They slowed down considerably. We move on into the summer, and remember, late May, early June, states started to lift their stay-at-home orders. People were allowed to move around a little bit more so in some regions than in other regions. And what do we note? Well, in places like the South, when governors lifted stay-at-home orders, there's a bump up in those positive shifts. We see more people moving out into the countryside. We see that in the Midwest. It's a little bit slower. It happens eventually in the Northeast, but not immediately. And the Northeast, we know, had the most cautious approach to managing the pandemic. Those stay-at-home orders lasted considerably longer in the northeastern states than in, say, Alabama or Louisiana or Oklahoma. Most recently, sort of in 2021, the bars are lower in the Midwest and in the South, but in the West and in the Northeast, we see most recently this year renewed positive shifts into the non-metropolitan counties of the Northeast and the West. So it seems like there's a little more regional variation in where people are moving as the pandemic has progressed. We can look at this county level analysis by what the Department of Agriculture calls degree of urban influence. So they have these urban influence codes and they assign these to all non-metropolitan counties. So we've got micropolitan counties. Cheshire County, where we all are, is a micropolitan county because Keene is a city that surpasses 10,000 people. And then we've got these non-metropolitan counties that are adjacent to a metropolitan area or adjacent to a micropolitan area or not adjacent at all, the most remote, most rural counties. And again, what do we see here? Those blue bars are relatively small. So with respect to urban influence, 2019 wasn't very different from 2018. We see spikes during the early stages of the pandemic. The bars are highest, upwards pushing 15% in these micro and metro adjacent counties. So where were the initial surges of people going? Into those rural counties, but those rural counties that were proximate to metropolitan or micropolitan centers with some kind of access to an urban center. They were going also to the remote area, the most remote rural counties, but to a lesser degree. We see in the summer or the late fall, late summer, early fall, renewed surges in those adjacent counties, population movement towards those adjacent counties. But most recently, this year, most of these bars are fluctuating around 0. But when we look at the micropolitan, we see 3 consecutive months of persistent positive shifts. So as the pandemic has progressed, it seems like there's more interest, or at least more devices relocating to not those suburban or fringe ex-urban places, but those counties that contain a medium-sized or small-sized urban center. Like Keene, exactly. All right, so that's the county level analysis. Let's move to the tract level analysis. And I'll be quick. I know that I'm talking a lot, but it kind of excites me to be talking to a live audience. OMB draws these metropolitan and micropolitan boundaries every 10 years once we get census results. And counties are our building blocks of metropolitan areas. So a county can be metro or it can be non-metro. There's no gradations in between. And a county can be micro or non-metro. So I grew up in Rochester, New York, in Monroe County, which contains the city of Rochester, and I grew up in a pretty typical suburb with, 3/4 acre lots and single family homes, sort of moderate density. But as you go down, there's 6 counties that make up the Rochester metropolitan area, and Ontario County to the southeast is part of that metro area, but this is the landscape in Ontario County. It's a decidedly rural landscape, but it's a rural landscape that's housed within a metropolitan boundary. Similarly, here's a map showing those metropolitan areas and micropolitan areas for Vermont. And Washington County, where Barry is micropolitan. But this is the landscape in Washington County. Again, a decidedly rural landscape in something that's, at least categorically according to the census, more urban. And if you look at this map, there's more micro and metro counties in Vermont than there are completely non-metropolitan counties. And nobody would describe Vermont as a heavily urbanized micro or metro state, right? So these county-based designations are really unsatisfying. Well, the Department of Agriculture provides tract-based classifications similar to the metropolitan designations. And what we have here is a map showing those tract-based classifications. You can be part of the metro core, those are those high-density urban tracts. You can be part of the metro commuting, which are those rural tracts, morphologically rural tracts, but have some functional linkage to that metro core. And you have the same kind of categorizations for micropolitan, core commuting, and then completely rural, more isolated tracts. If you look at this Rochester metro area, you can see that large sections of Ontario County are classified as rural but have that commuting connection. Similarly, if we look here around Barrie and Montpelier, you can see those urban core tracts, but those non-metro rural tracts within Washington County that have some degree of connectivity. So we get to break up those county-based classifications. So I've run this analysis at the tract level as well. So what does this reveal? And it's the same kind of figure. And I include the metro core, the micro core, rural, metro commuting, micro commuting on this figure. The first thing I want to draw your attention to on this figure is that metro core. And what do we see here? A lot of things close to zero in 2019, but the minute we hit January 2020, what happens to the devices? Significant negative shifts. Negative shifts for every month of 2020. So there were fewer devices in those cities, meaning, at least if we believe the relationship between devices and people, there were fewer people populating those cities or at home, according to Safegraph. If we look at the early stages of the pandemic, we see surges in devices. The biggest surges were happening into those rural tracts that were commuter sheds into either metropolitan areas or or micropolitan areas. Really big spikes in devices relocating to the places outside the small towns, outside those cities that were 10 to 50,000 residents. And some going into rural, but not nearly as high as, say, those functionally connected rural tracts around the small towns. And most recently, which I think is really interesting, while the micro core places didn't see very big shifts during the early onset of the pandemic, in 2020, there seems to be more devices landing in those small towns. The Keens, the Berries, the Boone, North Carolinas, those kinds of places. And not as much going into the micro commuting and the suburban areas. So perhaps people are wanting some kind of urban environment, but not an urban environment where there's millions of people around you, but an urban environment where there's tens of thousands. And the last thing I've done is I've disaggregated this analysis for two regions, the Northeast, which had one kind of approach to the pandemic, and the South, which had a different kind of approach to the pandemic. So here we've got the Northeast, and I want to draw your attention to just how steep those negative shifts are for the metro core in the Northeast. These are the New York Cities, the Philadelphias, the Bostons, those really densely settled old cities of the Northeast. And we've got negative shifts of upward pushing 10% during the summer months of 2020. They've rebounded, or at least moved closer to zero more recently, but there were a lot of devices leaving those urban core areas of the Northeast. And where does it appear that they were going? Well, just as the New York Times reported, there was renewed interest in those suburban areas. There was rising interest in getting that single family home. If I'm going to be working from home, I'd like to have an extra bedroom that can be my office. I can't get that in, the East Village. And in those micro commuting, more recently in the Northeast, we see really big surges in late 2020 and 2021 in the micro core into the small towns of the Northeast. And while we didn't see this nationally, there's also increased devices and rising positive shifts into the more rural, remote tracts in the Northeast. If we contrast that to the South, there was considerable movement into those suburban kinds of places outside small towns and outside cities, outside bigger cities. We see similar renewed kind of growth in the micro core, but much less shift into the most rural portions of the South. So again, as with that county level analysis, when we shift down to tracts, it seems like there's unique regional signatures with respect to how devices are relocating throughout this pandemic. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Well, it means the migration's response to the COVID-19 pandemic is difficult to capture doing what demographers and geographers like myself have always done, rely on census data. We've had to get creative. I've had to learn how to process tens of millions of records rather than one count for 3,000 counties. That seems so pedestrian now, which is what I had been doing for the first 30 years of my career. The analysis suggests that rural outmigration slowed and in-migration accelerated into many rural regions across the country. It was happening not just in the West or in the Northeast, but in all regions. The most remote non-metro counties, the surge was pretty short-lived, but those with access, those adjacent, had more persistent gains. And I think most interestingly, with respect to the people that are attending this conference, that tract level analysis shows that there appears to be a renewed surge or increased numbers of people choosing the core tracts of those micropolitan small cities, those cities that are 10 to 50,000. So places with main streets and downtowns that look like Keene here appear to be attracting more folks. That's it. And I guess I'm to hand this to you to field questions. All right.
All right, so do we have any questions in the room for Peter before we move on to Cheryl's talk? I'm just going to pass this on.
I'm just wondering, when you were collecting the data, did you look at things like a lack of housing inventory in some of these communities? Because I know in my community in particular, there's people begging all the time for somebody to sell them the house. So I suspect the numbers would be higher if there was better inventory. So I was wondering if you looked at that as well.
Yes, I have a research assistant that's looking at some real estate data right now. And there isn't a consistent database that reports housing inventory in every state. There's different laws regarding what real estate transactions have to be reported and what don't have to be reported. But for the states that do report inventories and the pace of sales, we've seen an incredibly rapid increase in the number of transactions to a point where there's just no more homes left to sell. So talking to the realtors in and around Middlebury, where I live, they said it was great in the summer of 2020, but by fall of 2020, there's nothing left to sell. And Vermont has really conservative constraints on building new housing. So it's difficult for the construction sector, for all sorts of reasons, to adapt and build more homes quickly. But yeah, there's strong evidence of real pressures on the inventory of homes. And Sherry will talk a little bit more about some of the places within Vermont that are attracting folks. And the places that saw the biggest surge in some of the devices were places that had ski areas where there was an inventory of vacant homes that people could move into on a rapid, pretty quick basis. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a land use clerk, and so I have to mine the assessment database. And what I noticed was, just informally looking at deeds, because I have to look at the deeds individually, that, yeah, I live in a rural town, and people were moving from eastern Massachusetts just sort of hand over fist, and do you know, my question is really, I was just looking at scans of deeds. Do you know if that is aggregated into some base showing like where where the grantor and the grantee came from, or is it's just there? You haven't used that.
There is no like national clearinghouse where you
No,
can.
I meant just in like in New Hampshire, it's county by county. I don't know what it is in Vermont, but
Vermont is by municipality, so it's not even at the county scale.
Oh, really?
My research assistant is working with a private sector firm, Redfin.
Oh,
It's kind of
okay.
like Zillow that just tracks transactions, but not where the buyer is from or where the seller is going to.
Okay, so that you'd have to just look.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sarah
okay,
did
never mind.
ask this morning, like what when you're talking to people, don't just say what you do, but say what you need. And I'll tell you what I need. So the data that I'm using are these free data that are just raw counts
Sure.
of people in a place. The same company will sell me for $80,000 individual phones
Sure.
and where they are at home on a month to month basis. And they've given me a sample of that data. It's like the drug dealer giving you a little taste of the drug. I'm coveting this, and I'm talking with the Department of Agriculture right now, and I'm preparing an NSF proposal, because if I could get 2 years of that data, which would cost $80,000, so that's what I need $80,000, then you can get a to and from. So you can say all of those new phones that are landing around Stowe, Vermont, 11 were in Brookline, Massachusetts a month ago, or were in Chappaqua, New York. And because it's month to month, you can see like how long did they stay before they moved back or on to someplace else. So that's just like, so for someone like me, that's just like crack.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask, I mean, were you able to get this data because you were an academic? I mean, could a small town government employee get hold of that? Because it would
I don't know. It's
Safegraph was
Safegraph, and it's under this broader umbrella that came out early in the pandemic called Data for the Common Good.
Yeah.
And there are all kinds of different entities that are providing data. So Google provides some free data on there based on how much mobile devices are moving around within a county to see, like, did people actually start staying home at a particular place? It doesn't show this device was in this place and now it's in this place, but it's just like, on average, phones in this county in December of 2019 traveled 4 miles each day from their point of origin, and now they're on average traveling 2 miles per day. So that's a reduction of 50%. But Google provides that data through this Data for the Common Good portal. It's on GitHub.
Are there any other in-room questions before we switch over to some virtual questions? One more? Okay.
It's too early to tell now, but do you know if anyone at your school or in your field is following how this is changing the culture of rural areas?
I'm going to leave that because that's more in the domain of Sherry. But yeah, that's a really, really important question. And the proposal that I'm cooking up is, give me the big data so I can identify the right communities and kind of document this on a macro scale. And then you can identify, and now I want to go spend 4 weeks in this place, which all these people returned to, versus this place, which all these people left. Because that's where you can begin to assess those kind of on the ground transformations.
So we do have a couple virtual questions just to bring into this. One kind of builds on the housing conversation. So Anne had a question: is there any connection with housing prices and supply that you're seeing with these from the realtors' data?
Oh yeah, that Redfin data shows very clearly prices just skyrocketed. I mean, there's been reports coming out for Vermont that home prices are 40, 50% higher this year than they were a year ago. And that's great for someone coming from out of state or out of market. I can't sell my house because I could never then go and buy a house. So, but somebody coming from San Francisco would look at my house and be like, $550,000, what a bargain.
So this shifts the conversation a little bit. So Dawn asks, is there any consideration in this data about the social unrest that also may have caused people to move to rural places?
That's a good question too. And I think it, I can't say anything definitively from these data. These are just counts of devices in places. But I know Sherry, in the focus groups that she's done, I attended a couple of them, you start to hear people's stories about what were some of the factors that were pushing people towards rural areas or towards Vermont. And it's a combination of factors that kind of crescendoed during the pandemic.
And Dawn's follow-up question, and this might be something that really leads into our talk later with Sherry's presentation, but do we know the demographics of those who are moving to these rural places? And so,
Not from these data, no. So there are limitations to this, for sure, but we don't have anything to capture what the populations that might be changing. But again, going back to the way you might envision studying this extensively is first you identify the places where there appears to be large numbers of people moving. Then you do on the ground work to try to kind of describe who the people are, where they're coming from, both their demographic attributes, but also maybe their politics, their kind of the transformations in the cultural landscape, et cetera. There's one more question in the room. For the virtual people. Yeah.
Is there anything in your research that's addressing what people are doing to deal with the housing crunch? Because that's like, I'm coming from 4 really small towns in Vermont, and they're just, it's in, yeah, what you just said, like up 40%, like there's nowhere to live. Like, so people are living in really like just pretty marginalized housing.
Yeah, again, that's not something that I have examined explicitly, but it's clearly the follow-on implication to this. You saw those negative shifts for those metro regions. All those people are somewhere, even though it might only be a 5%. The denominator for that 5% is massive. So those people are all distributing out to other places where the denominator is much smaller, so the relative impact is much greater. And all of this has happened so rapidly. Even if you had great systems in place to provide housing, you can't do that between April and June. Like, there's just a limit to how rapidly you can put up homes. And we know you can't do it that rapidly, even if all those systems are in place. So yeah, but clearly those are the follow-on implications. But what I think is pretty clear is the stories that are reported anecdotally in the press aren't just one-off instances, but it's pretty extensive in terms of aggregate numbers, and it's pretty extensive spatially. It's happening in most regions, more so in some types of places like the small towns than in other places.
Will you continue doing this type of data analysis to see if there's actually a shift back toward metro or that type of thing over the next year or two as the pandemic kind of goes up and down?
I'm really fortunate that I'm on sabbatical this year, so I get to do this all the time Yeah. So, yeah.
You have
But
to
you
provide
probably
us
listened to me
with-
too long now, so Sherry's up.
So I'm going to describe a research project that I conducted this past summer with the help of a research assistant named Cal Hale, and also with support from Pete. So Pete's analysis, that sort of large-scale analysis that he's just shared with you, was helping me frame in-person interviews with new Vermonters. So people who have moved to Vermont since the start of the pandemic, March 2020. Up until as recently, I think, as August 21. And I'd like to also just pause to thank the Radically Rural organizers and all the volunteers. This has been a tremendous amount of work that you've put into this, and we really appreciate the fact that you are navigating both in person and online, which is something that that I just know on a small scale, teaching in 3 different formats right now at the university, and it's like a new adventure every day. So I'm going to start with a little background about the state of Vermont. So we're diving from the national scale and the regional scale right down to the scale of state for my presentation. So Vermont has a rural settlement pattern, and I was like laughing to myself at one of the maps that Pete just showed of when you break down into the census tracts, like or census whatever blocks, whatever those were, that showed the commuting region, the metropolitan commuting region into Burlington, because one of those counties is Grand Isle County, which is a series of islands in Lake Champlain that has no high school, has no grocery store, and has no hospital, but it's still green in that map. So that's just to say that sometimes even at that scale, the coding is accurate. It's mathematically accurate, and those people do commute. But once they get home, they're living in a very different place than Burlington. So we have a rural settlement pattern. We have a very small population in Vermont. About 625,000 people live in Vermont. And we also have a concentrated population, and this is a process that's been happening over decades, to the point that 1 in 4 Vermonters live in Chittenden County, which is that metropolitan area around the city of Burlington. For frame of reference, for people who aren't familiar with this part of the country, the city of Burlington has 42,000 people. So it's a small city. We are often identified in the national media and in popular imagination as a blue state, a very liberal state, but we are led by a very popular Republican governor. So we have mixed governance in our state. We have a history of outmigration that reaches back more than 200 years. So Vermont has been dealing with the crisis of outmigration forever, and the recent couple of decades of outmigration have been especially concerning to policymakers and leaders and business folks, to the point that the state has put in incentives for people to move to the state. So prior to the pandemic, well, actually they just re-upped it, but there were incentives of up to $10,000 for people who moved into Vermont and were doing remote work. So we were serious about trying to attract people. And I'm noting here, which is obvious for folks that are from New Hampshire, that Vermont is a cold climate, it has 4 seasons. It's also a super cloudy place, which I think people don't expect when they're moving to Vermont, but we have cloud cover similar to Seattle. So that means that the winter can be hard and winter can be dark. The start of this project came from just living in a rural place in Vermont and noticing, hearing in our local media, as Pete pointed out, these stories of people moving to Vermont, hearing it also from national media, and also just looking around, the once a week when I would go to the grocery store, noticing the new license plates in the parking lot, and hearing from people who are involved in real estate about the just run on housing and the increased values and what people and neighbors were selling their homes for. So it's all sort of anecdotal. And so it led me to ask this question, well, are we actually experiencing in-migration? Or is it just kind of where I happen to live that we see newcomers? And in fact, when you live in a rural town, as you all know, any newcomer feels like cause for celebration. So we don't know. Oh, where's my advance? There we go. So that was my question. Have we actually seen a rise in population or a change in, as Pete noted, less outmigration, perhaps? And what we see this is a November to November comparison, November 2019 to November 2020. We're seeing that it's mixed when you look at it at this scale. So there are places that have negative numbers of mobile lines at home, and then we see places with increases, and it varies. And so what we decided to do in our study was to try to get coverage, geographic coverage across the state and all different kinds of communities to see what we could find there. So the resulting study is titled, Who Are the New Vermonters? And I was curious to meet these people who were moving into the state, partly because as a lifelong Vermonter, I'm really curious, what is it like to move here when you're from away? What is strange and odd about a rural place to you? What is strange and odd and quirky, maybe unique to Vermont or a Vermont town? So that was really interesting to me as a migration researcher. But I also wanted to know, what resources are they bringing in? What skills do they have? What interests do they have? And how might all of that combined impact rural communities into the future, rural landscapes into the future? So this is where I'm wondering what kind of social and physical landscape impacts these folks might have. So Cal and I conducted 6 group interviews over the course of this summer. And we gathered people together in groups of, well, one group had just one person. So the group was made up of 2 researchers and 1 participant, but we've had groups as large as 8 people. And 1 was in person, 5 ended up being online. And these were the questions that we asked. What brought you here? Basically, what was your life story before you got here? What did you imagine? What was your geographical imagination around what you would expect once you were here? What did you think your life would be like once you got settled? Great question was, what has surprised or irritated or challenged you? Because the irritations were really funny and also insightful. And then what questions do you have? So we tried to build in an element of giving back in this research. And so we reserved the last third of the interview time to say, okay, what questions do you have for us that maybe we can answer? And Pete took part in 2 of these. And so the 3 of us would just field questions from whatever, and the questions were really varied. But we hope that they would get something in exchange for taking part in this research. And we also hope that they would have this added benefit of meeting other people who are also new like them and start to help them build a social network, which happened. So who were the people that took part in this research? This was self-selecting. So it's really important to make that clear, is that these people chose to be part of it. And they were contacted either through a previous survey that they filled out by a colleague of mine at UVM, or they responded to a post in a listserv. We have a listserv group called Front Porch Forum in Vermont that we used, or word of mouth. There was a mix of ways that we recruited for people, but they all self-selected. So we can imagine that these are people who are willing to be part of a conversation who joined this research, and maybe is not representative of all people who've been moving to Vermont recently. So we collected data on their incomes. Most of these folks were in the $100,000 household income or higher category, but we did hear from people who were making less than $50,000 a year as households, and in between those ranges. Most of them had some kind of previous connection to Vermont. So it could have been that they went to a summer camp there, or they maybe had a family member living in Vermont, or a few of them had gone to college in Vermont. So there were different connections that they had, not all of them, but most of them. They moved, the people that we talked to moved from a bunch of different places, but notably they were from urban areas with 2 exceptions. And they moved all over. The people that we talked to live in 10 different communities in Vermont, ranging from Burlington, 42,500 residents, to communities with 475 people. So I want to first underscore something that Pete referenced in his talk, that there are constellations of factors that come together in an individual person's life that prompts them to make the decisions they make around residence, where they're going to live, whether they're going to be mobile or immobile at any particular point in their life. And I want to demonstrate that with just the story of one of our participants whose pseudonym is Nikki. She came from California. And when she was living in California, she was thinking about moving and getting the heck out of California for climate-based reasons, physical geography-based reasons. She is a scientist, so she was attentive to climate factors already. She was predisposed to think that way. She lived near a fault line. She was aware that it was due to move soon. And she was tired of wildfire smoke. So she was thinking about it. Then COVID happened, and that was a push factor. It was, or what I might call a shaping or an enabling factor. Because COVID meant that her work and her partner's work went remote, and that gave them mobility that they didn't have before, right? And then she said another shaping factor was Canada wouldn't take us. So apparently that was her first choice. And she said that Vermont was the closest place to Canada she could imagine. So that's how they started to think about Vermont. And then there were a set of pull factors here, that there were some family ties. She'd gone to college in the area. So there were some things that were kind of like beckoning them and making them feel like, yeah, maybe we'll go that way. But the real deal clincher was they looked into where they could have high speed. And once they determined that there were communities in Vermont that offered high speed internet, that cinched the deal along with being able to find a house. It's important to note that they found a house that they considered substandard, that they kind of regret buying, that they are moving out of, and they're actually moving to New Hampshire to care for an aging family member. So the mobility continues for her, partly because of the housing situation in Vermont. So just bear in mind, I'm going to share with you some of the major themes that we heard for describing the factors that brought people to Vermont, but it's not as if we can code one person just into one category. They often would name many things as they were explaining their individual stories to us. So these are the emerging themes. The analysis is not fully complete yet. You guys are getting the beta version right now. So first of all, I would describe these people as housing risk takers. Many of the people bought a house without seeing it in person. Many. Or rented a place without seeing it, which seems like that, both of those are kind of risky, but buying a house, like putting your life savings into something like that without actually seeing it is, to me, it's astounding. So these are people who felt pushed enough or pulled enough to come to Vermont that they were willing to do that. Most of them felt like it was luck or some divine intervention that allowed them to find a house, because they were acutely aware of how difficult it was, which was why they were buying homes online. Internet connectivity for these folks was definitely a deal breaker if it was not present. So something to think about as we're looking at the communities that we represent in our work. And it just underscores something that we all know is how important high-speed, good, reliable internet connectivity is. And yeah, so people felt like it was just a crazy time and that it was just luck that they were able to find a home. And then there was a degree of reflexivity amongst the people we spoke to that was really refreshing to hear and really interesting to hear. And that is, several people said they knew that they were coming into Vermont with more resource than a lot of people who already live in Vermont. and that they were able to pay the prices that were being asked, the 30, 40, 50% above asking price for homes or rentals. And this second quote comes from a young woman. She's 30. She went to college in Vermont. She left Vermont. She got a high-paying job in tech in California. When her job went remote, she knew she wanted to come back to Vermont. She was able to afford an apartment in Burlington. She was describing a friend of hers who has lived in Burlington since college for the last 10 years, who's recently had to move out of the city and to the next county down, to Montpelier, because she can no longer afford to rent an apartment on her income as a barista. And so is now traveling 45 minutes from one place to another to keep her coffee shop job. So she was very aware that she had privilege and others don't. And this was something more than one person expressed to us, that they realized they were perhaps part of a gentrifying force, but didn't want to be part of a gentrifying force. Another category of mover, I would say, we might call them kind of environmental and recreational movers. So these are people who were pulled to Vermont because they knew if they were working remotely, at the end of their work day, they could get out onto a trail really quickly or get to a swimming hole and cool off. And they were thrilled by this. They just spoke really passionately about these advantages that they have in terms of recreation. But it wasn't just that they were outdoorsy people who were going to go rock climbing or skiing. There were also just people who were moving from, I remember there's one couple that is coming from New York City, and they were just in awe of the stars at night, being able to see stars at night, seeing wild turkeys in their yard. And for them, you know, a third of an acre or 3 acres of land is like a vast wilderness, and they're just appreciating that. Another category, which I'm differentiating from the previous category of like sort of physical geography movers, are climate change movers. So these are people who said, I am moving to Vermont because I'm afraid of the effects of climate change in my home place where I'm moving from. So they call themselves climate change refugees, although they're the kind of refugees who can afford to determine the course of their movement. So one woman from Colorado, Winston, was talking about the air quality and where she lived in Colorado, the water quality, living near a Superfund site. Those really propelled her out of Colorado and into Vermont. Another person who moved from Cape Cod, actually, which I don't think of, but she opened my eyes to the fact that Cape Cod is a place with a lot of beaches, which are eroding away, a lot of development pressure. She left there to come to Vermont by looking at a climate map. So we are seeing this first wave of people who identify as climate change movers. Again, people with resources in our STEMs. And then there are people who are really thinking about the social and political climate factors. So I'm calling them social and political selectors. It was really interesting. There's a sense that they were coming to Vermont for this kind of liberal or more diversity accepting climate. And there were, interestingly enough, in one of our last groups, there were 2 couples who said that they specifically moved to Vermont because they had a non-gender conforming person in their family. And they felt that life would be easier for those people, or at least slightly more welcoming in Vermont than the states that they were coming from, which were red states. So they specifically moved to Vermont for a very identity-based reason. But there were other sort of more general factors. And it was interesting because those folks moved into a region of Vermont that we Vermonters consider the red part of the state. We're like, yeah, but you moved to whatever. Like, you moved to the red part. And they said, oh, no. Vermont doesn't have any red. They think they're red, not compared to where we come from. So they kind of put a different spectrum of political beliefs, you know, in our heads. Patricia, who's African-American woman was talking about how comfortable she felt because of this welcoming environment in the community that she moved to. The presence of Black Lives Matter signs make her feel safe and welcome. So another sort of more subtle set of factors that came up here were that people wanted to engage. They wanted to be in a smaller community where they could get involved and see the impact of their work and develop relationships, much like what Sarah was describing this morning. And there was a sense that they wanted to be part of this change, and they also felt a sense of responsibility back to a community. So while there's been a lot of discussion in our country recently about individual rights, there's one person in particular who expressed, here in Vermont, I see people who assert their individual rights, but they also have this sense that they have to give back to their community. That's the deal. It was really interesting to hear from an outsider. Something that I didn't expect, honestly, and maybe it's part of this is because these are folks who self-selected into the study, so they're engagers already. But these people want to be part of community, and they want to do it through volunteerism. And there were people in our groups who had only been in their new town for a month or 2 months, and they had already joined up with the local conservation commission. But you guys know how that works, right? Somebody contacts your office and they say, I have a little background in conservation, and then they're on the board, because we always need people on our town and municipal boards. But they are also doing things like delivering meals to migrant farm laborers. They had already connected into United Way. They had already figured out how to drop into different town meetings through Zoom. And that was a really actually interesting thing to hear how they were using these opportunities that were never available to us before to like kind of get to know town by dropping into all the different meetings. And so these people both want to be here, want to join the fire department, work on trails, but also say it's a little hard. You know, Vermonters are kind of guarded. They're really polite and they say hello to you, but they're not necessarily inviting you over, which of course is hard to do during COVID. But they're friendly to a point, but then there's this like New England thing that happens after that. And so that was really interesting to hear that that's how they felt. They felt a little bit of resistance, like it was going to take some time to really dive into a community. And then again, you hear this reflexivity again from David about not wanting to be seen as a carpetbagger. And interestingly, one of the things that we heard multiple times was how much relief they felt when they finally got Vermont plates on their vehicle. They were no longer being stared at, as they went down the road or in town. So what does this mean? This is just sort of a quick surface level analysis of some of the big themes that we've heard from these 24 people that we've had the pleasure to meet. What does it mean for those of us who care about rural communities and are trying to plan for the future? I think one lesson is that we need to reach out to engage with these people and also harness their energy. These are people that are bringing in really rich experiences and skills into our rural towns. And many of them are eager to be called on or invited in. So what can we do to make those opportunities more visible? Pete and I were talking about this a little bit in the context of youth sports, because we're both have been involved in coaching youth sports. And we know that there's no place you can go online to find out how do you coach lacrosse in Middlebury. It's just word of mouth. Well, what can we do to make those things actually more visible and more open and welcoming to people? We're probably going to have to do more stuff on social media platforms. Give people opportunities to learn about place, walks. My son is a forester, and he is offering free, he's a forester who's interested in mutual aid. So he's giving community walks into natural areas for newcomers and local residents who want to go, and asking them to do a deed of good service in some other way to pay back to their home community. A couple of people talked about how important it was when they finally got invited to a neighborhood barbecue and outdoor barbecue, right? Distance barbecue. They said it was huge for them. And then ask these new people what community events might revitalize your town, things that we haven't thought about because we're swimming around in our pond of the familiar and they're bringing in fresh perspectives, right? And then let's talk about planning a little bit. And this gets to some of the questions that you all were asking after Peter's session. Do we actually have room to accommodate people? No. At least where I live, we don't. And one of the things that's true about New England is that we have very old housing stock that often needs a ton of attention before it's maybe certifiable by the inspector when a land transaction happens. And in a place like Vermont, as Pete mentioned, it is difficult each town has its own zoning rules. And some of them are quite tight. A lot of rural communities have 10-acre zoning. So it's difficult to put up new housing rapidly in that kind of environment. So we need to just think about that. Does that mean that we need to start thinking more regionally and more at the state level? Probably. And as a colleague of mine has pointed out, those town zoning rules that we do have could be run over by a really high-paid lawyer very easily and drain the coffers of a town's legal fund. So it's just a reality. We need to think in a different set of scales now than before. Can we accept future climate migrants who don't have resource to buy a house at all? We know we can't accept them in our biggest city of Burlington because students can't even find housing now in the biggest city. Students whose parents are paying for their housing. So what do we do about that? How do we plan for people who are not going to come with savings in their bank accounts? And then it would be kind of interesting to engage newcomers and longtime residents in a conversation about what makes our place unique. What do we already have here on the ground? This is, again, echoing a bit of what Sarah said at the end of her talk. What do we already have that we can leverage, that we can improve? What's really missing that we need to add? And what can we do to our little tiny village downtowns? If we know that there's been a draw into the micropolitan areas, the kind of small cities and large towns like Keene, what can we do to those places that are much smaller villages to create enough infrastructure there so that those are welcoming places to newcomers who are oftentimes remote workers, or at least in this phase of migration? And I spoke with a planner recently in northern Vermont, and one of the things that he shared with me is that he's noticing that the small villages are seeing an increase of migrants who are remote workers. And the impact that they're having is that compared to the long-term residents like me, who drive 45 minutes to my job in Burlington, because they're remote, they don't leave town. They're in the village all day long. And at lunchtime, they want to get out of their house and they want to walk down the street and get a coffee or a sandwich, just see people. They're starting to revitalize things like the Grange, which was a project that long-term residents have had in mind for a really long time. It just couldn't sort of shepherd the resources to make happen. But now here you've got these people who never leave town, who they want to help out. So that really opened my eyes to another dynamic of perhaps a different form of community development that may be available to us that we didn't have before, at least in the areas where I'm familiar with. Okay, so that concludes my formal presentation to all of you, and I'm happy to accept any questions that you have. Yeah, let's start there.
Questions from the in-person audience for Cheryl?
Thank you for your presentation. I think it was really well done. I'm from Vermont, and I've sort of seen all of this unfold before my eyes. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about what you think the implications are for affordable housing and conservation work. As you know, part of the funds from property transfer tax goes towards the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board.
there have already been challenges in Vermont with affordable housing and conservation. And I feel like this new influx of folks puts even more pressure on those groups. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. I know that all different kinds of organizations in Vermont are focused on this and realize the urgency. And as Pete said, we can't fix it in a 2-month time scale, maybe not even a 2-year time scale, because remember what happened to building supplies in the spring and summer of this past year. You couldn't get a gutter at Lowe's. You just couldn't. The price of lump. We went into our local sawmill to do a project for our chicken coop, and they said, "Yeah, we're out. Like, we are out of wood." So there was a resource issue. There's a land and zoning issue. There is also a planning issue. We have done a lot to talk about affordable housing, but I don't think that our zoning rules have really, in our small towns, have really grappled with it sufficiently yet. And so we need to do that, and we need to have a statewide conversation about it. And I think one thing, this is sort of a pet idea of mine, or a pet peeve, but we do have a state planning office in our books. It's just not activated. And if we could activate that, not to create statewide zoning, but to help further this conversation, I think that would be a really big benefit to the cause. So I feel sympathy for all the people that are working in the nonprofit and for-profit sectors trying to make this all happen. You couldn't get a carpenter to come work at your house. I talked to someone in my neighborhood, and they said they're doing 2 years out planning now. So we have a real crisis of resource all around.
Since there's no new housing, this is kind of a zero-sum game. So my first question is, who did these people replace? I mean,
Who did they replace?
yeah, I mean, if they moved in, somebody must have moved out. And so that just changes the community in a really small community. And my broader question is I live in a town where almost all the old families are gone. And it's mostly, quote unquote, new people, but it's been happening since the 1950s. How is this different? How is getting a whole bunch of new people all at once different from the sort of historical, Flatlander incursion that's been going on forever?
Oh, thank you.
So
Now we need to keep this polite. Oh, we're in New Hampshire. Okay, never mind. That's a great question. I've been wondering, your first question, where are the people who are selling their homes going? I have no idea. And who are they? It's a great question. I've been wondering that as I drive around the countryside and I look at the for sale signs, and I'm wondering who those people are. I have talked, this is anecdotal, not part of my research. I have talked to some folks who said, I've been thinking about going to North Carolina where it's warmer. I've been thinking about going to Florida. I've always wanted to. Now's my chance to actually make a big chunk of money so that I can do that. So I've heard that from folks. As Pete said, some of these housing situations were people moving into their second home. So they already had a second home in Vermont and they're moving in full time, although those aren't the people that we spoke with. Some moved in, some of these newcomers came in with family and were living with family while they were looking for a place. Some are still, so I didn't name these folks, but some of these people are still looking for housing and they're doing long-term Airbnb if they can get one. And then just hoping that when that Airbnb is up in a couple months that they'll find something. And they're developing networks of people who are looking for them. So it's like people are just scratching, right, for whatever. And I forgot your second question. Oh, what about the communities with all these new people? It's interesting because my sense is they're really dispersed. Even though that map that Pete showed of like there are towns that seem to be having more people and some that have fewer. our research was across the state, and so there were like people who are just like, they were the new people in their town. There were some clusters in the Upper Valley, though. Actually, in the Upper Valley, there's some clusters of like a lot of people moving, but a lot is 4 families. Which, again, if you're in a town of 800, that's a lot. But so I think it's a little bit dispersed, and I think my guess is, I don't have data to show this, but it's where the housing was available. Because the people we talked to, they were not, except for one person who knew she had to live in Burlington because she's right on the bike path and that's her passion. Everybody else were sort of ecumenical about where in Vermont they would go. Some who were in the sort of middle income range were choosing places away from Chittenden County because of affordability. Yeah, I think that's right. And also we have to remember we're only, 19 months or something into this pandemic. So when we look back on this historically, it'll look like a big bump probably. But as we're experiencing month by month, it's like kind of dispersed.
So I can tell you, I chair a community advisory committee in a small town with about 1,400 residents. And so we're doing some of this already, which is great. I can tell you anecdotally that I know some families have had to move because the home they were renting was a second home from someone who's living out of state who decided to sell. And I know that there's been an increase in maybe younger families or young professionals who are home sharing with family or somebody who they had a previous relationship with. So that has accounted for some of the growth in our town. My question is more like, this is great, the information about the new people that came in, but what we tend to hit up against the most is the people who self-identify as the founding families or founding fathers who don't necessarily want new people to come in or think that new people means negative change. And that's been our biggest challenge. So I wondered if you talked to people who'd been in towns for a long time about how they felt about new people coming in.
We didn't do that as part of this research, although having X number of generations before me in Vermont, this is familiar. Yeah. And I also think it's based on my other earlier migration work with Vermonters. They're loud voices, but they're also a minority, I would say. They're loud voices, but they're a minority. And some of the folks, the newcomers, feel it. So they feel the looks in the store when they get out of their car with the out-of-state plate. One woman, it was actually, she had to pull off on the side of the road to take a phone call in a rural area of Vermont, and somebody drove by her and yelled slurs at her. So it's a real thing. But after being here a little while, they're finding that the most of the people that they're encountering are very welcoming. And that's why those informal barbecues and invite over are so incredibly powerful for building community and building those social networks, so that those resistant ones might come along, and there are some resistant ones who are never going to come along for their own reasons. Maybe because they're seeing the negative, they've seen decades of development that they don't really see themselves in, over time. So I think that's where some of that resentment comes from. It's Catherine Kramer, a political scientist, calls that rural resentment.
I was just going to say that we see it a lot when we propose any zoning around affordable housing, it just gets voted down. So,
yeah.
Like that's.
Right, and and then you hear a lot of the negative stereotypes about who would live in affordable housing and blah, 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 blah. And, Yeah, we just have to do the good fight. Keep up the good work. Pete, do you want to join me up here in case there's stuff that you can respond to?
Thank you so much for this presentation, and I apologize for stepping in late, so forgive me if this is redundant, but I'm really curious about the skills shortage that you mentioned around, for example, contractors being 2 years out. And is there any kind of program or incentives to publicly sort of make it aware of these skill shortages and then promote folks coming from other states that have these skills to fill these kinds of jobs or services? Is there anything like that that you've seen happening in your area?
I'm not aware of any formal program to fill the voids in, say, electricians or plumbers or some of those skilled trades that we might be seeing a bottleneck in the construction trades. I mean, we're all aware there's a labor shortage. It's kind of ironic that unemployment remains persistently high, but there's jobs that are going unfilled nationwide. So it doesn't seem like there's a geographical fix that's likely to solve that problem.
Yeah, I think it's a temporal thing. So, for example, we can imagine scaling up our vocational programs to produce more skilled people in construction and in design and planning, all those things. But there's a lag between building the program and getting students through. But I think it's a fabulous idea, and I think it's something that those of us, right, who do rural development work, like, have been talking about for a long time. A mismatch between what we're offering in higher education and what the sort of on the ground needs are in rural communities. So maybe this is the moment when we kind of say, okay, let's fix that problem.
Other questions from the room at this time? Oh, while we're thinking, I do have one from a virtual attendee from Anne. She said, our local government here works very differently from more urban areas. I wonder if anyone has thought about a good way to orient people to how it works here. I hear newcomers frequently referring to the county doing things, not understanding that the county has a much smaller scope of activities in New England versus the municipal government.
Yeah, that is just a regional difference, right? That in New England, a lot of times there's much more power held at the town or municipal scale. The county, at least in Vermont, there's a court system works through the county, and sometimes you have a county sheriff system, but that's pretty much what the county does. And then it's the state, right? So we have state level work, state powers and town powers, and the county is a much weaker scale of government than in other parts of the US, for sure. Yep.
I think one of the observations you made from one of your respondents, though, speaks to possibilities for the kind of newcomer orientation almost. And if more counties can adopt, or more municipalities can adopt these high flex modes of participating, so people can learn more, like, well, how do I get that burn permit so I can burn the leaf pile in my yard? If as municipalities have learned how to provide access to their meetings remotely, it's easier to, click in with your camera off and learn about, the day-to-day or monthly operations of a municipality. That's something that is a low cost, but potentially high reward activity that communities can continue to do. Even if most of their meetings go to in-person, you can access them remotely and maybe see some, to get that kind of orientation that you're talking about, so that people can learn a little bit more which levers you need to pull to accomplish task X or task Y. I was going to make one more comment to the questions about housing that have come up, that because this pandemic has also unfolded in a rural reality of really rapid population aging. And we have rural communities and rural elders that are aging in their homes because we don't have a vast supply of elderly housing in rural areas. It may be an easier pill to swallow for rural communities to get behind building senior housing than it would be to get behind building, quote, affordable housing, because the stigmas that are attached to affordable might be greater than the stigmas attached to the elderly. And I know in my little, neighborhood of 12 homes, they sell immediately once they go on the market, but they just don't go on the market very often because they're populated by these elderly couples or individuals that don't have any place else to go. So they're aging in place in infrastructure that's not well suited for them to age in place. If there was a place for them to go, there'd be more homes that came on the market that would allow for younger or different populations to move in. But that seems to be one of the log jams. We do have really nice, but really expensive senior housing in Middlebury. That's like $5,000 a month. That's not accessible for the people that are living in those single family homes and aging in place.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question that might be too early for you to answer, but and it's for both of you. Are people talking about going back? Because I work for the town, and so I'm sort of a point of contact, and I've encountered a lot of dissatisfaction from the new residents. Like, what do you mean you don't have garbage collection?
That came
Yeah.
up.
And like, I have a brook on my property, I need a bridge across it. And I'm like, well, build one. And they're like, what? and so, things like that. They just, real serious cluelessness. And so I was wondering, when you were questioning them or with the cell phones, is there a back migration yet, or talking about it?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, at the end of the, when I asked, is there anything that irritates you or challenging or something you want to know, we got all kinds of stuff about recycling, especially in Vermont. And now we have this food waste law, so you're not allowed to put any food waste into your garbage. So that's another layer of complexity. This one guy was saying, my entire garage is devoted to a sorting system, and I still can't figure it out. And there's a 48-page guidance document that I'm supposed to follow. It's like little things like that. Who's super good-natured about it. But I think we haven't seen the dissatisfied folks because these are self-selected people who were wanting to be part of a conversation. But I've heard that question raised by others quite often. How long will these city folks stay, or the second homeowners stay? And a big question there is, how many corporations and businesses are going to call back their workers to in-person? And so there was this sense that they were all going to go home, or at least some members of the family would go home at the beginning of this past summer. And that really didn't happen because of the second wave. So then they thought, okay, they're going to go back all in September. And again, that hasn't really happened yet. So I think a huge factor will be what workplaces are going to do in the future for some of these folks. And I think, I guess I feel a little bit like people should live where they feel comfortable. And if it's so uncomfortable to be in a rural area that's so different from what you're used to, maybe they're not well suited. And that's okay if they leave, because it creates another home available for somebody who is suited to live here. So it's like we have to kind of be flexible with these things a little bit.
Yeah, I totally agree that it depends. That question is going to be answered by what employers decide to do. And I think there will be a mix of what employers decide to do. Some will offer more flexible work arrangements. Some will distinguish themselves as being, we are a bricks and mortar place where you get to come in and work in person every day. I think there will be geographic implications to that. If you've got this flexible work arrangement where you can work from home, maybe not all of the time, but some of the time, those proximate types of rural areas are going to become more attractive because they will need periodic access to an urban area. And I think there will be a demographic variation. I think the young people that went home when they shifted to remote work, they're going to move back to the cities. And the people with school-age children, they might decide that, yeah, we enjoyed living in wherever, like in Brookline, Massachusetts, for example, but, you know, living here in Heinsberg or is actually pretty appealing. And so there'll be a demographic stratification to the people that tend to stay versus the people that tend to return. That individual level cell phone data will let me assess where people are staying, where people are moving on. So I'm going to pass around a plate, you know.
All right, well, it's almost up, but we have one final in-room question before some closing remarks.
I was just wondering if you see any value in looking back, because there have been other times where Vermont has seen influxes. I'm thinking of the 60s and 70s, and I can't remember the author, but the book Going Up the Country kind of looks at that influx and its impacts on Vermont, and just anything we could learn, or have you looked back at sort of other times where we've seen these influxes?
That's a great point. And what that book shows so beautifully is the really long, well, I'm not a historian, so I can say really long term is like 30, 40, 50 years of what exists now in a place like Vermont as a result of the ideas, and not just the ideas, but the put into practice ideas that influx of people brought to the state. And there are lots of institutions and businesses in our state that are connected to that time. So I think it will be interesting in the future to see what does change. I think one factor, as I'm looking into the future and thinking about climate change and maybe long-term impacts of COVID, I think we're going to have a different set of factors that we're working with than that wave of in-migration, than we're at work during that wave of in-migration. So I keep sort of like casting into the future and saying, okay, what about the people who are going to move to places like New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, Quebec, because we will still have water, probably, maybe more than we want sometimes, maybe less than we want sometimes, but definitely more than Colorado. And we will still have open land for agriculture and forestry. And so what do we do to prepare for those folks who come because they can't live on the coast of Florida anymore because the coast is gone, for example? So I guess I've been like not casting back as much as I should have, but your question's a really good one. And I've been actually casting forward and saying, this is all well and good for people who have money, but what's Northern New England going to do? What are the other Western states that are seeing these in-migrations going to do for higher numbers of people if that takes place? And we're in true crisis.
And if we look nationally, not just focusing on Vermont or New Hampshire, like you said, there have been periods where there have been rapid growth in the rural population. The 1970s was one of those periods that particularly impacted a place like Vermont, but so were the 1990s. The 1990s were what we call the rural rebound, and counties across the country, non-metropolitan counties, enjoyed more rapid population growth than they had, say, in the 80s. Those people have largely stayed. So and that was enabled by developments in information technology. People that could work from home started to work from home. Now we're seeing, in the context of COVID, more people that are forced to work from home. So going back to that first question along this kind of theme, it depends on how long those home work relationships persist, or to what extent the pandemic reconfigures the relationships between home and work and kind of the geographic relationships between home and work.
Well, please join me in thanking Cheryl and Peter for a wonderful presentation.
And thanks to the behind the scenes tech crew that I hope for the virtual attendees has worked seamlessly for them.
Yeah, thank you very much.